So you've left Islam. You might now be asking yourself, how on earth do I deal with this profound, niche, and incredibly isolating experience that I'm finding myself in? Where do I go from here? Who do I talk to? What do I do? How do I figure this all out on my own? Well, first of all, the most important thing to know is that you are not alone in what you're going through right now. In fact, you never have been alone in this experience, no matter how often or how much it's felt that way. Everything that you've been through and that you are going through in your journey from leaving Islam, millions of people around the world are going through something very, very similar. I get so many questions from those people asking me for advice and for help and just kind of looking for some direction as to where on earth they go to from here. Unfortunately, I rarely ever have time to respond to people individually, so I wanted to take this opportunity today to actually answer some of those frequently asked questions that I'm getting from ex-Muslims. I do want to acknowledge that what I'm going to discuss today might not be applicable to everyone out there. Ex-Muslims do exist on a very broad and diverse spectrum in terms of the issues that we deal with, so I can only speak from my personal experience and my personal observations, but hopefully there are some of you out there who will find this useful. How do I tell my parents and family that I left Islam? Well, first of all, in my opinion, I think you're asking the wrong question here. It's not a matter of how do you tell them. The first question you need to be asking yourself is, should you tell them? And this applies to not only disclosing your apostasy to your family, but pretty much everyone. The best way to approach this question is through the lens of safety. You need to think very carefully about what kind of risks are going to be associated with disclosing your apostasy. You need to be thinking about things like, do you still live at home with your parents? And are you financially dependent on them? Do you live in a Muslim majority country? Is the government on your side in terms of your apostasy? If you are still living at home and you know that you're dependent on your family, whether that be financially or in terms of accommodation, then this probably isn't the best time to be having this conversation with them. You need to think about how this is going to affect you and your safety and your stability in life. At the end of the day, you know the people in your life better than anyone else, and you are the best person to ascertain whether or not it's going to be safe to have this discussion with them. Start by considering all the potential outcomes that could happen and then go from there. If you do decide to go ahead with this, you need to think very carefully about how exactly you're going to communicate that information. Please do not make a Facebook or Instagram post in a fit of rage because you're just going to leave yourself having to deal with damage control in the end. Make sure you pick the right time and place. Aim for a calm, controlled environment, and if you are worried about things like your physical safety, then you might want to consider doing it in a public space. Make sure that no matter where you have this conversation, you have an exit strategy planned in case anything goes wrong and you decide you want to leave or call it quits. Think very carefully about the words you choose when you have this discussion. Try to frame everything from your point of view and use I statements. So for example, I think, or I feel. This is going to reduce the likelihood that they're going to feel like you're personally attacking them. Emphasize that this is about you and your beliefs and your thoughts, and it's not a reflection of them and their beliefs and what you think about them as human beings. Please try not to get angry and start saying things like Muhammad is a pedophile or anything like that, because it's probably not going to end well and the discussion isn't going to be very productive and potentially not even very safe. If you're saying stuff that you know is going to be very offensive to them, then they're probably not going to be receptive to anything you're saying at all. Just try to keep it simple. Explain to them that these are your personal beliefs and that you acknowledge and appreciate that religion is important to them, but at the same time, you can't revolve your entire life around their expectations and what they need to feel happy and secure within themselves. At the end of the day, your parents, your family, or whoever it might be are the only people responsible for their happiness. The only person's happiness that you are responsible for is your own. It's really important that you make sure you're considering every potential outcome. And that's going to include things like, unfortunately, being disowned, which happens a lot in the ex-Muslim community. So for example, for me, I spent so many years reconciling with the fact that that was going to be the most likely outcome if and when I had this discussion with my parents. By taking the time to think through that, process it, and problem solve how I would approach it for many years before I actually told them, it was much easier when that outcome eventuated for me. Once you've said what you need to say, put the ball back in their court. Explain that you want a relationship with them and you don't want any of this to come between you. At the end of the day, you are only responsible for yourself and your life and your actions. You can't control how they're going to respond, and you're not responsible for whatever their response is, even if they are completely gutted and upset and it breaks their heart. That is not a reflection of you and something that you've done wrong. That is something that they have control over, and only they have control over. Remind yourself that you've done all that you can do. The rest is up to them. How do I tell my family that I'm marrying a non-Muslim? Honestly, I'd give very similar advice to that of disclosing your apostasy to people. You need to weigh up all the potential outcomes, assess the pros and cons, and then decide if it's actually worth having that conversation with them. So with that in mind, if you are going to talk to them about your relationship or your marriage to a non-Muslim, you need to prepare yourself for the fact that it's probably going to open up a can of worms and lead to a discussion about the fact that you have left Islam. So again, make sure you're ready for all of that and make sure it's something you actually want to do. So for me personally, when I weighed up the pros and cons, I actually decided not to tell my parents about my partner. I'd been with my partner for a long time, and at that point I still hadn't told my parents about my apostasy either. So I knew that if I talked to them about my partner, it was going to lead to that discussion, and for a long time I just wasn't ready for that. I recognized that having that discussion with them was just going to cause me and my partner so much unnecessary stress and backlash that we could avoid by simply not telling them. So I've actually been with my partner for nearly 8 years now, and my parents don't know that he exists, and I'm okay with that. But again, that's me personally. That's what I chose to do. That's what I decided was best for me, and it might be completely different for you, and that's okay. How can I escape from my Muslim household? This is a huge question, and it's going to be very dependent on what your individual circumstances are. If you live in a Muslim majority country, then this is going to be quite complex and difficult to approach. So because I was born and raised in the West, I can only speak from the perspective of someone who has left their Muslim household but did live in a secular Western country. Okay, first things first. Financial independence. The best way to leave your Muslim household is going to be becoming financially independent as soon as you possibly can. The only way that you're going to achieve this is by working. If this is an option for you, I highly recommend gaining a qualification in a high demand job as soon as you graduate high school. I get that that's not going to be an option for everyone, but if it is something you can do, I'd say go for it. Browse your local job websites and look for roles that are constantly in demand. If you can get qualified for those kinds of roles, then you're setting yourself up in the long run. You'll be able to make sure that you always have an employment option. It's also going to allow you to have a regular and reliable income for the foreseeable future. If you can't or don't want to study, then working is your next best option. Work as much and as hard as you can, and make sure that you're spending and saving your money very wisely. If you live in Australia and you are studying, I highly recommend applying for AusStudy or Youth Allowance. If you save all of those payments, they're going to start adding up really quickly. Leading up to the day that you actually decide to leave, you need to plan meticulously. You're going to have to consider whether or not it's worth telling your parents in advance that you're leaving. Again, this is going to depend on the safety perspective. If you know that it's not safe for them to know that you're going to be moving out, do not tell them. Even if you know that it is going to be safe, if you know that they are probably going to be emotionally manipulative, then you might not want to have a discussion with them about it until after you've actually left, because they might try to stop you. Think about things like how and when you'll actually leave, and how can you plan to make sure that you can do that safely. Make sure that you have copies of all your important documents far in advance. You also want to consider things like, if you have a car, is that registered in your parents' name? Because if it is and you leave without telling them, they can report your car as stolen. So you need to consider all these small details leading up to the day you actually leave. This is a very particular one, but it's one that affected me substantially, so maybe it'll help you. You need to check if you are still listed under your parents' insurance. So for example, car insurance or health insurance. The reason I say this is because if they take you off their insurance, you're going to be starting all over again in terms of waiting periods. So typically with insurance companies, especially health insurance, the longer you've been with them, the greater the benefit you'll receive when you do make a claim. So just consider small details like that. Make sure that you know your destination destination? Where exactly are you planning to go the minute you step out that door? Are you able to secure a rental in the months leading up to your actual departure? Do you need to get the police involved and inform them of your situation in advance just so that they're aware? If something does go wrong and you need help from the police, you don't want to be explaining your entire story to them when you're in a state of crisis. So if you can make a contact at the police station before you leave home, that could potentially help you a lot in the future if things do go wrong. You might need to think about things like emergency accommodation or refuges, or do you have a friend that's willing to have you stay with them once you leave? Consider all the potential problems that you could face and make sure that you're problem solving those far in advance, because you don't want to be left to do that when you're already in a state of panic. Okay, so that might work for people who are living in the West, but what about people who are still living in Muslim majority countries? So take into consideration all the advice that I gave for people living in the West, but obviously you don't want to do things like get the police involved, especially if you live somewhere with guardianship laws, because that's probably not going to help you. Unfortunately, it probably is going to be a much longer and arduous journey for you if you're still living in a Muslim country. One of the best options that a lot of people I know have taken is to study abroad. Now, I recognize that that is very expensive and it's going to be dependent on your particular socio-economic circumstances. But if that is an option for you, I highly recommend pursuing that if you can. At the very least, that's going to give you an opportunity to get out of your country, to get away from your family, and then start exploring your options for relocation from within a Western country. It's also just going to give you the space and freedom to be yourself, which could do wonders for your mental health. If you do end up studying abroad, make sure you're being very careful with what you post on social media. So for example, if you know that you're drinking or you're dressing in a way that is going to seriously upset your family, don't post that on a public forum. You want to make sure that you're embracing your freedom as much as you can, but don't place any unnecessary risks upon yourself. Make sure you're researching refugee and asylum seeking pathways as much as you possibly can. Think about what destination you want to aim for and do a lot of research and reading into how that process works in that particular country. If you can, it would also be a really good idea to save some money and get yourself in touch with an immigration lawyer. They can give you much more specific advice about the requirements for seeking asylum in the West. They're also the best people to help you with actually writing those applications. Definitely consider linking in with organizations like Secular Underground Rescue, Atheist Alliance International, or Rainbow Railroad. These organizations are known for helping people specifically to leave and escape their home countries. There's no guarantee that they're going to be able to facilitate that process for you, but it's best to get as much support with this as you possibly can. Remember that taking care of your mental health is also a really important part of this process. So try to get in touch with mental health clinicians who live in the West. For example, Recovering from Religion or Free Hearts Free Minds, the organization that I work for. Looking after yourself is the most crucial step. Then you go from there. How do I get over the fear of hell? So this question kind of applies to religious trauma in general, because getting over the fear of hell is a part of religious trauma. Firstly, you need to recognize that indoctrination, especially childhood indoctrination, is incredibly powerful. A lot of people assume that once they've left Islam, that's it. They're off to a free and happy life now. But that's not quite the case. In reality, leaving Islam is actually the first step. Challenging and reshaping those deeply ingrained ways of thinking is always going to be an ongoing process. Deconverting from a fundamentalist religion means that you are literally rewiring the neural pathways inside your brain. It is very much a physiological process. So this is going to apply not only to overcoming the fear of hell, but overcoming religious trauma in general. If you've grown up genuinely believing in and fearing these very graphic depictions of hell and torture in the grave and all that kind of stuff, then it's not something you're just going to let go of overnight. It's the same thing as how a lot of ex-Muslims will still struggle to eat pork for many years, or they might find themselves still having hostile attitudes towards Jewish people or LGBTQ people, or sometimes you'll see ex-Muslim men who still maintain quite misogynistic attitudes. It's something that you need to actively and consciously be working on if you actually want to overcome these things. Recognize that it is normal for these things to linger, and that's often going to eventuate in things like feelings of religious guilt. So definitely don't take it as a sign that you've made the wrong decision and that this is Allah's way of telling you that you left the one true religion. This is literally nothing more than the impact of childhood trauma and childhood religious indoctrination. One of the best ways to actually overcome this is by talking about it. And quite often what that looks like is going to therapy. For me personally, it also really helped to conceptualize notions like hell through a deductive reasoning approach. That was a process that actually helped me to recognize how sadistic and ridiculous the concept of Islamic hell actually is. Obviously, it also helped a lot that there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that hell even exists at all. So remind yourself that logic is your friend in your deconstruction process, and eventually, with enough time and effort, you will start to let go of these things naturally. How do I leave Islam? I get asked this question a lot, and to be honest, I don't really think there is a correct way to answer this. Only you can determine if and how you leave Islam, or any religion for that matter. I can't teach you how to do it or even tell you that you should. You and you alone are the only person who gets to make that decision. What I can do is share with you my own thoughts and experiences with leaving Islam. So for me personally, it was never a conscious decision. There was no point at which I decided, that's it, I'm leaving the religion. It was a very, very slow, ongoing process for many years. I never actually had any intention of leaving the religion. It was actually setting out to learn more about Islam and restore my iman that led me to leave it. Because the more I learnt about it and the more I studied, the more I realized that I didn't believe in it at all. So long story short, my recommendation to you would be to learn as much as you possibly can, study the religion, ask all the questions you need, and never ever accept the do it because Allah said so. We just need to accept what Allah says. We shouldn't question it. Do not accept that as an answer. You deserve better than to be told not to think critically and for yourself. Because Allah said so is not a reasonable justification for anything. Hopefully there are some of you out there who will find this video to be useful. If you have questions that I didn't talk about in this particular video, then please send them to me and I will try to make a part 2 as soon as I can. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope you got something out of this. I hope you're well. I hope you're all doing okay, and I'll see you in the next video.